Welcome everyone to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, March 18th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part 3. Last week we presented part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. Today it's Twin Towers and the extreme heat. We'll be looking into the evidence of very high temperature and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let you all know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is go to ae911truth.org and go to Continuing Education and find the live webinars listed there. You'll see a questions and information form box. So just type your questions in there. I'll also be looking at the Facebook comments under this webinar broadcast and the YouTube comments for any good questions or comments related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. And let's jump into it. Because we use the scientific method at AE 9/11 Truth, you learned about it in the 7th grade. What do? We have a question. How do the towers come down? We do some background research, make some observations. How have other towers come down? We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess. We look at all the hypotheses without respect to our personal or political or financial obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter as to how the towers came down. Maybe they did come down by jet planes or fires, maybe explosions, for which we looked at a lot of evidence in part 2 of this 3-part series. Free on YouTube, just search part 2, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. And maybe it was controlled demolition. We showed a lot of evidence for that, and we'll be showing a whole lot more today. We make predictions based on these hypotheses. We test them with experiments. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If it's not, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis, and that's what we've been about last week and this week in this series. And until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence and so forth. So with that in mind, let's jump in and find out what forces destroy buildings. An important exercise here. Not that fire ever has destroyed a steel frame high-rise building before 9/11, but say in a wood frame building, this is an organic, chaotic process. The fire burns out in a modern skyscraper. It burns out in about 20 minutes, looking for fresh new combustibles. And even NIST admits that the fires in the Twin Towers did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. And we've already begun to see many, many, many holes in the NIST argument here. We'll look at more today. So when a wood frame building, say, because we haven't lost a steel frame skyscraper, but a wood frame building would begin to fall over. It would fall over in stages. It wouldn't fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the tons of structure, cold, hard, and intact, beneath the fire. So it would behave very differently. And how would it behave in a steel frame building? Well, let's take a look. We have the largest test of its kind, 8-story building in 1995, built in the UK just for the purpose of burning it down. As you can see already, we have steel members that are not even fireproofed in this construction, because they wanted some of the worst case and some of the best case fireproofing methods to see what would happen in various parts of the building, with huge fuel loads, as you can see here, trying to reach temperatures approaching 2,000 degrees. We do have some non-fireproofed beams. Well, what happens to those? Let's see.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, Jonathan Barnett, the fire protection engineer with FEMA, is referring to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. And yet, so in the conclusion, in the executive summary here, is that it's an inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form, even with beams that are not fireproofed. We have minor deformations. Maybe it will sag. The connections do not fail. And yet this is one of the key problems associated with the NIST report. And as we saw in Building 7, all the connections were failing in a building that was designed primarily like this, the steel frame connections, particularly. So we looked at that in part 1 of this series. So I encourage you to take a look at the third tower that came down on 9/11, wasn't hit by an airplane, and yet it dropped in 7 seconds, 47 stories at free fall acceleration, symmetrically down. It's amazing to behold. So look for that if you haven't seen it. Now, these buildings have collapsed. They fall over to the path of least resistance due to natural causes, in this case, earthquakes. The concrete and steel the concrete columns and beams in these cases are not severed one from another. The building is recognizable as such, though badly damaged. It doesn't look like a house of cards, like we looked at in Building 7 particularly, and something very different with the Twin Towers. Now, these buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds that are expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the hot gases from the ignition of the explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. And we will be seeing, and we've seen lots of these features and witnesses in last week's part 2 of this 3-part series. We can, of course, use the skills of half a dozen companies in the United States that are capable of generating explosions through shaped cutter charges and placing them throughout the columns and beams in high-rise buildings in order to bring them down in a very precise order. In a process called controlled demolition. This is how high rises, most all of them, have been brought down, given that not one before or after 9/11 has completely collapsed due to fire. So there's a set of features that we looked at last week. Let's just review real quickly. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually near the base of the structure, but not always. A straight down or near symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, because there's a pattern removal of column supports. We saw that the building came down at near free fall acceleration, and that the members were totally severed one from another almost. And we saw limited damage to adjacent structures. No, not with the Twin Towers, but with Building 7, and a classic implosion. We saw something very different with in Building 7, a classic explosion. The Twin Towers, a very explosive, with lots of damage to adjacent structures. So we have patterned explosions that are seen by witnesses, heard by witnesses, flashes of light that are seen by them. We have broken up concrete floors into fine pulverized powder in the case of the Twin Towers and Building 7. And explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the explosive industry. And we have chemical evidence of explosive devices left behind. These are typical features of controlled demolition. Fire does not have these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. And yet, no fire has brought down a steel frame skyscraper before, or, as you'll see, after 9/11.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and regarding Building 5, it was fully engulfed in flames. We'd expect if any of the skyscrapers were to come down, in this case mid-rise office building, it'd be this one, right? No. Fireproofed steel frame skyscrapers don't come down before, on, or after 9/11 with these additional massively engulfed fires in these buildings. And yet these fires, which are few and small relatively, at the time of the collapse, diminished, indicated by the thick black smoke that they're oxygen starved and cooler fires. So you see why we have a huge problem It's a completely unprecedented event. Well, NIST even acknowledges that the jet fuel from the plane was burned up, 90% of it outside the building. The rest of it was gone in 10 minutes. We have a few damaged columns, but it still doesn't add up. Why? Well, steel conducts the heat away. This is why we haven't lost a steel frame skyscraper. The steel never gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. So we fireproof these steel members, 2-hour fire protection on the beams and 3-hour on the columns. So it's actually 4 to 6 times as much protection as it is needed, because as we saw earlier, the fires only last 20 minutes in a given area. So this is very, very good protection. And we also keep the tenants from bringing in fuel loads and the contractors from building the building out of flammable materials. In addition to all of that, we sprinkler the buildings so that they don't get, so fire never becomes a problem. So with additional circumstantial and corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, foreknowledge of the destruction, experts agreeing, yeah, that was a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a collapse is a controlled demolition or not. We have a body of proof now that we can apply to the Twin Towers. So let's do just that. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? We looked last week and we saw that, yes, indeed. It was smooth and it came right down. Was there patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by hundreds of witnesses? Yeah, we saw that last week. Straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint. We saw that. In this case, well outside the footprint of the building, 600 feet, with ejections hurled, 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections hurled laterally at 80 miles an hour. We looked at the near free fall acceleration of the building. We looked at the total shattering of the building, which NFPA 921 says it means that there was explosives. We looked at the lateral ejection of these structural steel components, and this last one was not lateral, it was ejections of building materials at the lower floors. Interesting. Yeah, that's the materials themselves. And then we saw pulverized concrete to a fine powder laid like a blanket 3 inches thick across lower Manhattan. All of that was direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of it could be caused by fire. We continue today's exploration with feature number 8, pyroclastic-like clouds. Well, what does that mean? The National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 says look for effects of explosions, thermal effects. What do we mean by this? Well, it says look for large volumes of gas and a large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, like we see ejecting out of the Twin Towers in all of the photos and the videos that we have available to us, expanding 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. Incredible heat that's required to cause this degree of expansion. Not the kind of heat that we would expect from these few and small fires that remained at the time of the collapse. No. And surely those flames were extinguished by the mechanical collapse itself, the mechanics of the collapse. No, we're looking for something on the order of this, and we find it as we look for the evidence here of extreme heat. Let's go to Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out and ironworkers with their boots literally melted, and then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
Indeed. And the structural engineers on the site citing the same thing, red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile, dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel, says the president of the cleanup company. Why are we looking at this? Because office fires and jet fuel can't possibly reach even a third of the temperatures associated with melted steel. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot beams, ranging from molten metal still red hot weeks after the event, molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. Metal dripping from a beam. Molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of one of the cleanup companies, in this case, Controlled Demolition, Inc., interestingly enough, molten steel was encountered primarily during the excavation of debris. We have videotape and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson. There was a river of molten steel, or a river of steel flowing. And his associate, Richard Garlock from Lyra, the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. As you see here in this video of the, I think it's a South Tower, pouring out of the material minutes before its collapse, pouring out of the side of the building. NIST says, well, this must be molten aluminum. Well, molten aluminum doesn't glow bright yellow like that in daylight conditions, as you see here. And as you see here, liquid metal falling out of the debris held in the claws of the crab claw excavator. And concrete melted too. This is in the Police Museum. You can see it today in Manhattan. Concrete, I didn't even know concrete could melt. It takes 3,200 degrees to melt concrete. It says fire temperature is so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path, including around this handgun, which is why it's in the Police Museum. And the fact that that was from World Trade Center Building 6, interestingly also. Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says fire protection engineer Jonathan Barnett, FEMA report author. There's a problem here, though. It takes 4,000 degrees to melt or to evaporate steel, 2,800 degrees to begin to melt it. So where's all this heat coming from? That's where we're heading today. But structural engineer Abolhassan Astani Azal says, who had a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel, I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center. He doesn't realize what can't cause that. What he says, if you remember the Salvador Dali paintings with the clocks that are kind of melted, can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. Not realizing that office fires don't get that hot. And they don't get this hot either.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
And this is documented also by FEMA in their original report before NIST took over the investigation from FEMA in 2002. FEMA had documented the metallurgical examination in Appendix C. What did they find? A 1-inch column reduced to half-inch thickness. Its edges curled like a paper scroll, have been thinned to almost razor sharpness. This doesn't happen by office fires. And yet here it is very well documented. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron, that's molten iron, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. But there's no clear explanation for the source of the sulfur. They just kind of ignore it. Where did all that sulfur come from? It's perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, according to the New York Times, and yet it's completely ignored by NIST, omitted from their final report. The entire Appendix C ejected, and none of this is included. Why? They, in a set of very frequently asked questions, which they finally publish on their website years later, about the sulfur and many other questions. Sulfur is present in the gypsum wallboard that was prevalent in interior partitions. Wait a minute. Gypsum wallboard has inert calcium sulfate in it. That's not sulfur. In its 100-year history protecting steel frame structures, it's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's been designed to protect. This is absolutely ludicrous, and yet another example of fraud on the part of NIST. The arbiter of competing hypotheses is experiment. Okay, let's take some calcium sulfate gypsum board, put it in a 2,000-degree fire if we can possibly reach those temps. Is there any hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel? No. No. Experiment is what NIST has been avoiding. The smell of sulfur, it burned, says Jonathan Field, a demolition worker at the ground zero. Can never block it out. It haunts me. And yet, who is in denial of all of this evidence? Let's listen to John Gross, co-project leader of the NIST report.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas in the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
They pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
And yet here he is, John Gross, on the pile, finding the very piece of steel that was cut off from this beam from World Trade Center 7's destruction, which we looked at in part 1 of this series, cutting off that, what they call coupon, for further analysis, and which was included in Appendix C also. So, of FEMA's report. And yet he threw it out when it came to his own report. His shadow is all over the evidence. Well, how do we get such temperatures? Jonathan, Thomas Iger suggests maybe at the Twin Towers the fires were 1,200 degrees. NIST claims 1,800 degrees without any evidence. The structural steel doesn't melt until about 2,800 degrees. So what can be responsible? Well, we'll be looking at some possibilities here today, but let's look at jet fuel first. The manufacturer, ME Petroleum, says that in open air, our jet fuel only burns at 600 degrees. That is about 4 times less, or 5, than steel melts at. So it's not the jet fuel, right? Hydrocarbons only burn about 600 to 1,400 degrees. Steel had definitely melted during the event, as we see here. The color of molten metals gives away its temperature. We're talking 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit in this case, even white hot, so hotter than 25 degrees, 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So what caused the steel to melt? And of course, in another very frequently asked question, NIST speculates that any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile than to short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Oh yeah? There's a law here. It's called the conservation of energy. It's a closed system. Fires burning under a pulverized concrete powder, theoretically non-flammable, in the basement of the World Trade Center, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create more energy inside the system. In other words, the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning. You can only convert the energy you have from one form to another. So in this case, the heat is dissipated, not increased. So what produced all this heat? Let's look at this feature. Could thermite have produced it? That's something we should look at. Let's do. What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermate were used, it would explain 3 things. One, the incredible heat that was generated. It produces 4,000 degree heat. It would explain the iron, which we're about to see a lot of evidence for, elemental iron, not just melted steel, but tons of iron, melted iron. It would also explain the presence of sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, becomes much more effective at cutting through steel. So was the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 followed? This is the guide for fire and explosion investigation, not only in this country, but many other countries as well. They say look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. They make this blanket statement, but later admit, a year later, in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. Wait a minute, you don't have any, but you didn't test for it? You couldn't find it? What do you, well, others did. In fact, it wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones, a nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, does some rational thinking. Well, he says, gosh, thermite would produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes before its collapse. It would also produce a characteristic burn pattern, whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising up off the falling molten metal. And like we see trailing these ejected structural steel members, ejected laterally Now, steel is not flammable, as we've already noted, under office fire conditions, or any conditions, really. So why are these steel members on fire? How in the world can that possibly happen? And this is not the only one. There are hundreds and hundreds of them, as you see on the left, World Trade Center 1. It looks more like a volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea, with outward arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds. You see why 3,400 architects and engineers are saying, not buying it. And the more we look at, the more we see. Both of the towers have these thick white smoke clouds trailing these objects.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
And yet steel's not flammable. So what's happening? Do we have a signature of thermite? Well, Stephen Jones continues his exploration, says it would leave behind unique chemical evidence also. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon. But more unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. Altogether, these elements in the periodic table of the elements, somebody sends him a piece of this 40-pound chunk of meteorite, they called them, because it's fused molten iron, pulled up by the hundreds from the World Trade Center aftermath. He says it has predominantly iron, so he can rule out right away molten aluminum from the jet plane. It's not molten aluminum. It has abundant manganese, so he can rule out structural steel as a major component. It has aluminum, sulfur, and potassium as well. So clearly, this is the residue of thermite that's been sent to him by the sculptor of one of the World Trade Center pieces. Fluorine and manganese. Well, manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels. So these are often present in the residue and are clearly part of a thermite fingerprint as well. But sol gels, interestingly enough, would leave yet another residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. Was that found in the World Trade Center dust? Well, the EPA analysis of the dust finds one molecule at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. He sent another piece of slag from this particular World Trade Center sculpture at the International Peace Park in Manitoba. He performs X-ray fluorescence analysis, finds what? Iron, sulfur, manganese, aluminum, the ingredients of thermite yet again. You can make your own cutter charge, shaped cutter charge, like John Cole Civil Engineer did in your own backyard. And this is what
Web
happens.
was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thin to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Well, wait, where did we see that before? Razor, thinned to razor sharpness. Oh yeah, in the Appendix C that FEMA performed on the steel from the Twin Towers that was immediately thrown out by NIST when they took over the investigation. We'll call it the cover-up. You can, there were patented devices prior to 9/11 that were much more efficient at cutting through thicker sections of steel with thermite in hundreds of milliseconds. Molten iron is ejected through the steel. Much more efficient than high energy explosives like C4 or RDX, which is one reason they might have chosen this application of cutter charge type. But another reason might be that it wouldn't have the very loud bangs associated with high energy explosives more commonly used in controlled demolitions. It wouldn't have the bright flashes associated with those high energy explosives either. But it would still leave behind its own signature, which we've been looking at carefully, and we're going to continue. In fact, there are devices whose casings themselves are made up of consumable consolidated thermite. Nothing left behind except pools of molten iron, which are seen and described by the first responders. But what else was found in the fine powder that was so ubiquitous across lower Manhattan in this 3 square mile area? As the USGS did studies on the dust, and it came out in 2005, the Particle Atlas of the World Trade Center dust, in which they find billions of small, almost naked to the human eye, previously molten iron microspheres. Billions of them. They don't know where they came from. They don't even speculate. But they comprise up to 6% of many of their samples. So they're elemental iron, which we know where that can come from, right? We know it's not background office dust because that type of iron is not spherical. But this is. And so the R.J. Lee group says these are formed during the event, not before by the welders, not afterward by the iron workers cutting down the remaining portions of the tower, but during the event. In fact, the EPA called them a signature component of the World Trade Center dust. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these previously molten iron microspheres. Well, where do they come from? Let's look at a small controlled experiment here where we see sparks, lots of sparks from a thermite experiment. They're not sparks, though. They're molten iron droplets, which are spherical, which are formed due to the nature of aerosolized liquids. They just form themselves into spheres due to surface tension. Could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars parked around the World Trade Center? What other rational example is there for the toasting of the tops of these cars in this very high heat event? And what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? A team of international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen examines the dust particles and finds these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other, dual layered, indicating they were applied with a fluid in layers. The largest of them are 16th inch long. It gets curious because they're attracted to a magnet, so they have a high iron content, one of the ingredients of thermite. So he zooms in he does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, finds what? Iron, aluminum, the ingredients of thermite, unignited. Boy, they get real curious then. They take it to the laboratory and they do electron microscope examination and find at the nanoscale these particles, iron oxide crystals in rhomboidal shapes and aluminum platelets that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is engineered incendiaries, because these are the ingredients, again, of incendiaries, iron oxide and aluminum powder. What are they doing there? Well, they're set in a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. That's organic material, which is used for the expansion of TNT. So it appears that we have an incendiary which destroys by means of massive heat, combined and re-engineered to become more explosive, which is very interesting. The peer-reviewed literature on this material called super thermite has been shown to reveals that when the particles are put in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, they ignite at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. When they do, they produce a lot of energy. And so these materials from the World Trade Center dust samples that this team of scientists experimented with do the exact same thing, proving that this is exothermic reaction, proving that it's basically a form of thermite. And so what happens when they ignite the chips from the World Trade Center dust? They produce what? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as those molten iron microspheres found by R.J. Lee in their studies of the World Trade Center dust. So we know where those microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that can be used in a court of law to bring down the real perpetrators of 9/11, if we can get such justice. They have engineered at the nanoscale these materials because the surface volume increases exponentially, making the chemical reactions virtually instantaneous, further demonstrating the explosiveness of this material. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So we actually know where to look if we can get some interest. And some real energy behind a real investigation. They conclude the red layer of the red-gray chips is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's highly energetic, pyrotechnic, or explosive material. This is documented in the 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It stands uncontested. Nobody has put up their own peer-reviewed paper to contest the results of this work. And that's how you challenge somebody's conspiracy theory. If you don't like their results, you put up a paper of your own. So today we've looked at 3 additional characteristic features, in this case very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. And these features are direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries. There's not fires. Fire doesn't cause these features. Again, none of them. So, especially not these fires, right? Which we have thermal imaging video of, released from the Freedom of Information Act request, showing that these fires, at least at this time, are not more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they can't possibly cause the melting of steel or iron. So what do the experts say? Again, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion. Ron Brookman, one of 100 structural engineers, signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation. Structural engineers, 100 of them, does not look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Ed Muniak, fire protection engineer. The fires were very weak. The NIST reports confirm that the steel temperatures were low. Yes, in their reports, they find no evidence for steel above 600 degrees Fahrenheit, even though they claim the fires were 1,800 degrees with no evidence whatsoever. The World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise collapse. So, surely the evidence would have been preserved in the most puzzling set of collapses in world history. Was it preserved? Let's listen to structural engineer Abul Hazem Astani Azal.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of steel went to China for recycling. What? Prompting Mike Bloomberg defensively to utter, just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. This is the steel that they always use to find out exactly what happened to a collapse. But no, it was dispersed to China for recycling, prompting editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, Bill Manning, to cry out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. We have 400 truckloads per day being carted away from the site, put on barges, sent to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. No one was prosecuted. So what has the scientific method shown us today? Did fires bring down the towers and jet planes, according to the official story? Or is it more like explosions and controlled demolition and incendiaries? We have to ask you that. What we showed today was the 8 key characteristic features, very uncharacteristic actually, along with some characteristic and uncharacteristic features last week, the first 7 features. That was all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't account for those features. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, we believe that the reason that we have more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition is that we have proof of controlled demolition. That's what's motivated them to take a public stand. And so we encourage you to do something about that. And the first thing you can do is ask us any questions you might have if you're live watching with us today. Andy will share with you how to get your question registered. Andy.
Okay, please submit any questions that you have in the input form that we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Go to continuing education at the top and select the live webinars. You'll see a box right there. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Okay, and there is your box right there. You can do that on our website. While you're there, subscribe to our email newsletter. You'll get a couple of them every month. And we'll let you know what the latest evidence is that we've put together. What are the efforts that we're taking toward getting a real investigation? And there are many of them, which you helped us with. But we want you to also get informed on our website. There's a lot of interesting. There's a whole lot of evidence there. And while you're there, sign the petition. We want you to take a stand along with these 3,400 architects and engineers, because there are 20,000 others that are supporting them. But especially if you're an architect or engineer, sign that petition and donate. Support our cause. We have efforts all over the country that we're making. We go to Congress at least every year with our petition, our new evidence, our latest film that we have. Become a member of AE 911 Truth also. For as little as a cup of coffee a month, you can join the family of sustaining supporters. You can do that right on our website. You can also volunteer. Andy, there are some ways to do that, right?
Absolutely. The easiest way to do it is go to ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form right on the page. You fill it out, and we'll get in touch with you and see how you can help out. And we've got things you can do regardless of the type of personality you are. If you're someone that's outgoing and likes to talk on the phone, there's work you can do. And as well, if you just like to do research on your own, definitely we can use help in that field as well. But the first step is deciding that you are going to be part of this, and it is a very important job, because I think that 9/11 pulls the rug out from under a lot of things that people are paying attention to in the last couple of decades and even now. So if you can participate and donate just a few hours of work each week, please consider doing so.
Yeah, please do. And I'm having a trouble with my computer here. So, Andy, why would you volunteer with AE 911 Truth?
I'll tell you what. I'll tell you how I first started volunteering back in 2010. I was already doing work on my own and doing my own website. And I came down to a presentation that Richard was doing. They were calling for people to do just local press conferences in conjunction with a press conference that Richard was going to be doing. I think it was in DC, if I remember right, a long time ago. But I did it. It was successful. They asked me to join, and it was a life-changing decision, along with waking up to the evidence in the first place. And you can really get a lot of satisfaction from doing it. If you're sober, if you really have the best intentions for the 9/11 Truth movement in mind, and you're willing to work as a team and follow direction, then yeah, definitely you can fit in and make a huge difference. And it's more than just showing up and at events and protests, things like that. It's actually doing a lot of work that maybe people don't even know that you're going to be doing. We do our best to highlight it, the work that our volunteers do on my show when it comes up. But we really need people who are willing to put in that unselfish effort. So that was why I started off, and I think a lot of people will find a lot of satisfaction from doing that volunteer work.
And look at all the ways the teams you can join here. There's just really quite an endless number of things you can help us with. You can take action steps on your own if you don't like working with people. I tend to be one of those once in a while. Call for a new investigation. You can reach out on your own to your elected representatives, your television, your radio, newspapers. Tell everyone you know. Screen the DVDs to folks. I'll show you one of those DVDs in a moment. Share the brochures one-on-one with people. Do whatever you can. Download the World Trade Center 7 finite element analysis, 130 pages. You can download it, print it, or just email the PDF to structural engineers and architects in your sphere of influence, because this was quite an effort. 4 years and $300,000 that people like you raised the money for, that care about the implications, particularly of these high-rises being controlled demolitions. What are the essential findings of that? The World Trade Center, the fire did not cause the collapse of World Trade Center 7, contrary to the fraudulent findings of NIST. The World Trade Center 7 did not experience a progressive collapse. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of every column in the building. So how does that happen? It happens only one way, and we've been looking at the evidence for that one way this week and last week. So we've mailed 75,000 postcards. That's the kind of thing we can do with your support, by the way. We can make a movie called 7. You can watch it now on Amazon. It's doing very well. So we encourage you to pass that link around. You can find that link on our website at ae911truth.org/WTC7 evaluation. Andy, that URL might be WTC7 ae911truth.org/WTC7. I'm not sure where that one is, but anyway, it's not hard to find. We'll find it for you. And so we encourage you to support the efforts that we make, like getting a new inquest into the death of Jeff Campbell. His brother, Matt, and his whole family is submitting a new application for that inquest by one of the top attorneys in London, which again was provided for by members of AE 911 Truth, $100,000 altogether, thousands of supporters pooling our resources together to make things like that happen. And this is what's inspired the 5 New York area fire commissioners to demand a new investigation, all 5 of them unanimously, and how we're able to submit a request for correction to NIST, demanding that they come clean with their fraudulent report. Why we're going to Congress, and with what? With a new act for a new investigation. Andy, can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. It's the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's we wrote it a couple of years ago. It's draft legislation for exactly what we've been asking Congress to do for years: look into the evidence of explosive demolition at the World Trade Center on September 11th. And we named it after Bobby McIlvaine, who tragically died as he was entering the North Tower that morning. He was killed by an explosion, and of course his father knows that the official story isn't correct, so he's worked with us for a number of years. Instant conversation starter with your member of Congress when you approach them with the bill, and you can actually download a copy of that at ae911truth.org/justice, I believe. And there's a number of ways that you can get involved just with your member of Congress. I mean, you can call them and leave a message on their answering machine. And they're set up for that, to hear from their constituents. And they may not remember every single word that you say, but they do take notes on what their constituents are calling them about. And have to take that into account because they have to get voted into office again. Make yourself heard. I mean, some Congress members are doing telephone town halls right now. And I've been called on to a few of them from various congressmen who got my email from work that we've done with trying to get this bill passed. So you can participate that way. If they come out into public again, certainly try to talk to them about this evidence as they come out and speak to their constituents, and call into live shows if they're on as well. And be respectful, be professional, but confront them with the evidence of Building 7's destruction. And we just sent out copies of 7 to members of Congress as well. I don't know if Richard mentioned that. There's a number of ways that you can get involved, but first you got to decide that you're getting involved. So please do any of those actions, both big and small, because they do make a difference.
They do. And this one did, or is going to, as we have a promise from the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan to submit the 60 exhibits in this application for a new investigation to a special grand jury. And we're suing them to make sure that they do. We're also suing the FBI because they didn't provide the evidence to Congress that they were tasked with doing. And we're still in motion with that effort. And we have a landmark film, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, because we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. And here it is. Just a couple of minutes. A teaser. You can find it free on YouTube.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We could speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yeah, and you can watch this video. It is really good. The 1-hour version is free on YouTube. I recommend the 90-minute version, which has a lot more evidence and testimony from a lot of people, including extended interview excerpts from the 40 high-rise experts all the experts. So that's available at our store at ae911truth.org, as is the Beyond Misinformation booklet. You can actually download it for free at beyondmisinformation.org. 50 pages, completely debunking the NIST analysis here. Very, very well done booklet, which is coffee. If you want to buy it in our store, the coffee table version is exceptionally well produced. You can give that to VIPs, have it around to show people. Our classic lecture on this series is available on YouTube, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth. Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center 7 is free on YouTube, 15 minutes, narrated by actor Ed Asner. And hey, let's get to those questions. How about it?
Absolutely. And I'm going to add too about Beyond Misinformation being a great coffee table book. If you're a dentist out there and you got your own practice, put it out in the waiting room. There'll be some interesting material for people to wake up to before their appointment. All right, we're going to take 3 questions today. First one says, NIST said the Twin Towers came down essentially in free fall. They seem to imply that this is no problem. Do we know if the physics professors from America's universities also think this is no problem?
There are several physicists that think it's a huge problem. We showed you examples last week of one of them, David Chandler. So at the universities, we have fewer of them. In fact, I can't name one offhand. They don't, and we've tried to make them aware of it. Those 75,000 postcards went to physics departments as well as civil engineering departments. We try really hard, and this is where you can come in. Send to your local university physics department a copy of the 9/11 explosive evidence DVD. Let's try to get them involved. We've got several students making projects out of World Trade Center 7's collapse to try to get their professors motivated. We've given presentations to at different universities, and we've generated a lot of interest, but nothing that creates an activist out of them yet. And so this is why we do need you. And this is a long uphill process. I mean, we're pushing a huge rock up a very big hill. We actually don't know how far we've got to go. We're efforting, every year at this. This may be the last year, the 20th anniversary, in which we have a very exciting project to unveil at the anniversary, which we think will create a whole lot of attention. So altogether, all of our projects are doing the job, but we need your help too in many different ways, as we've talked about already.
Okay, the next question asks, could the extreme heat be the reason why over 1,100 people were never found?
Last week, we looked at this disturbing reality that 3,000 people were found, but only 2,700 bodies or so were found. Only 300 whole bodies. And 20,000 pieces of bodies were found. 6,000 of them small enough to fit into a test tube. And yet, more than 1,100 people we find absolutely no trace of. So we would expect those bodies to be trapped and mangled between pancaked floors, right? In a real gravitational collapse. No, not a trace. So where are they? What happened to them? Well, high energy explosives at every floor traveling down, as we saw evidence of, lots of evidence in last week's part 2 of this series. Is the only thing that I believe could explain it. I don't think it's the extreme heat, but maybe it's the combination of the two. We clearly have evidence, as you've seen today, of thermite incendiaries. And we've seen evidence that it's been re-engineered to become more explosive. We don't know whether it's the high energy explosives or the re-engineered nanothermite that's responsible for that.
Okay, and the last question is, how many other building fires not collapsed were dismantled and sent to China?
Why do I find that funny? I'm not aware of any. Probably, first of all, we haven't had a steel frame skyscraper collapse due to fire, completely collapse. It's just, it doesn't happen to fireproof steel frame skyscrapers. So we don't have a historical record of what happened to the steel in them, because presumably, you know, after a thorough forensic examination, which we should have had 3 of the most thorough forensic examinations of surviving steel ever in the history of forensic examinations of tall buildings. We should have had that, but we didn't, because the steel was destroyed illegally in a crime scene. So they got away with it, presumably because these were designated as terrorist attacks, an act of war. So the crime scene investigation requirements were not applicable. This is one of the things that has been said. So that allows for a much more effective cover-up, I suppose. Andy, you want to add to that?
Well, I think you said it best when you said there's really no precedent for this kind of thing, but it just seems common sense to me that you would study the wreckage better than they did and not just ship it all off to another country, especially if there is anything nefarious going on. I mean, we're told that China is an adversary of the United States government, so why would you send all that evidence to another country to have on our officials here? But it kind of goes back, and this is not even related to the evidence that Richard's brought up today, but when George Bush was asked by a kid at some school, you know, what did you think when you heard that 9/11 was happening, or some question to that extent? And he said, you know, I saw the first plane hit and I thought, that's one really bad pilot. And I remember thinking, really, that's what ran through your head as president of the United States? It didn't occur to you that this could be intentional, or, you know, you didn't like consider that possibility? And so, you know, you apply this to the controlled demolitions of the towers, like it wouldn't run through your head that perhaps whoever did this got access to the building and that you should be studying this wreckage. It's what you would expect to happen, considering the gravity of this event and what we saw, but they didn't. Of course, that was to the detriment of truth and justice and why we exist to this day.
Well, also regarding that statement of Bush's, at the time he made that statement, nobody saw the plane, the video of the first plane hitting the building, which was the North Tower. Nobody saw that. There was only one video of that plane hitting that tower because it was the first one. And it came out after President Bush said that statement. So he must have been watching it on some kind of closed circuit TV, probably live. So that's the conclusion of many researchers, or at least the speculation.
Or he's just outright lying to the kid. Yeah.
He's just making stuff up, huh?
But yeah, you wouldn't think a president would be doing that during when it regards such a big historical event. But regardless, there were a lot of things that should have been done that weren't on that day.
Yeah, clearly. Well, we looked at a lot of evidence for a lot of things that were done on that day that are very, very unfortunate for our country, because they caused the invasion of 2 countries in which a couple of million people were murdered, and the erosion of our basic civil liberties through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, and the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. any of us can be arrested, thrown into jail without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. We could be thrown in there indefinitely. We can even be tortured. And actually, Americans can be assassinated, as you might recall, all for being associated with terrorism, which is not even defined. So very, very bad situation. We're involved in a $6.5 trillion global war on terror, which is why all these reasons and more, why 9/11 still matters 20 years later almost. So we're staying at it, and we're asking you to stay at it with us and to keep us supported as we continue our massive effort to get a real investigation through activities like our webinar, 9/11 An Architect's Guide, Part 3 today. We looked at Part 2 last week, and we started all over again in April. And the first Thursday in April at 1 o'clock. Join us as we look at the third skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11 into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. They say the reason, normal office fires. So join us for that body of evidence. Until then, we'll say have a great rest of March, and we'll join you in April. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and thanks, Andy.